Over its more than 2 centuries of history, the United States has seen its share of good and bad days. But there have been a few days that left Americans in fear for the future of their nation and for their own safety and well-being. Here are 8 of the scariest days in history of America. But before jumping into it, I'd like to remind you to subscribe my channel and hit the bell icon so that my videos notification can reach you right away. So let's jump right into what were the scariest days in the history of US. In 1814, during the third year of the War of 1812, England, having fended off its own threat of invasion by France under Napoleon Bonaparte, focused its extensive military might on reclaiming vast areas of still weakly defended United States. On August 24, 1814, after defeating the Americans at the Battle of Bladensburg, British forces attacked Washington, D.C., setting fire to many government buildings including White House. President James Madison and most of his administration fled the city and spent the night in Brookville, Maryland, known today as the United States Capitol, for a day. A mere 31 years after winning their independence in the Revolutionary War, Americans awoke on August 24, 1814 to see their national capital burning to ground and occupied by British. The next day, heavy rains put out the fire. The burning of Washington, while terrifying and embarrassing to Americans, spurred the US military to turn back further British advances. Ratification of Treaty of Ghent on February 17, 1815 ended the War of 1812, celebrated by many Americans as the Second War of Independence. The end of World War I in 1918 ushered the United States into an unprecedented period of economic prosperity. The Roaring Twenties were the good times, too good in fact. While American cities grew and prospered from rapid industrial growth, the nation's farmers suffered widespread financial despair due to overproduction of crops. At the same time, a still unregulated stock market, coupled with excessive wealth and spending based on post-war optimism, led many banks and individuals to make risky investments. On October 29, 1929, the good times ended. On that late Tuesday morning, stock prices, falsely inflated by speculative investment, plummeted across the board. As the panic spread from Wall Street to Main Street, almost every American who owned stock desperately began trying to sell it. Of course, since everyone was selling, nobody was buying, and stock values continued in free fall. Across the nation, banks that had invested unwisely folded, taking businesses and family savings with them. Within days, millions of Americans who had considered themselves well off before Black Tuesday found themselves standing in endless unemployment and breadlines. Ultimately, the great stock market crash of 1929 led to Great Depression, a 12-year period of poverty and economic turmoil that would be ended only by new jobs created through the New Deal program of President Franklin Roosevelt and the industrial ramp-up to World War II. In December 1941, Americans looked forward to Christmas, secure in the belief that their government's long-standing isolationist policies would keep their nation from becoming involved in the war spreading across Europe and Asia. But by the end of the day on December 7, 1941, they would know that their belief had been an illusion. Early in the morning, President Franklin Roosevelt would soon call a date that will live in infamy. Japanese forces launched a surprise bombing attacks on the US Navy's Pacific Fleet based at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. By the end of the day, 2,345 US military personnel and 57 civilians had been killed, with another 1,247 military personnel and 35 civilians wounded. In addition, the US Pacific Fleet had been decimated, with 4 battleships and 2 destroyers sunk, with 188 aircrafts destroyed. As images of the attack covered newspapers across the nation on December 8, Americans realized that with the Pacific Fleet decimated, a Japanese invasion of the US West Coast had become a very real possibility. As the fear of an attack on the mainland grew, President Roosevelt ordered the internment of more than 117,000 Americans of Japanese descent. Like it or not, Americans knew for sure that they were a part of World War II. America's long-held case of Cold War jitters stirred to absolute fear on the evening of October 22, 1962, when President John F. Kennedy went on TV to confirm suspicions that the Soviet Union was placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, a mere 90 miles from the coast of Florida. Anybody looking for a real Halloween scare now had a big one. Knowing that the missiles were capable of hitting targets anywhere in the continental United States, Kennedy warned the launch of any Soviet nuclear missiles from Cuba would be considered an act of war, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. As American school kids practiced hopelessly taking shelter under their tiny desks and were being warned, "Don't look at the flash," Kennedy and his closest advisors were undertaking the most dangerous game of atomic diplomacy in history. While the Cuban Missiles Crisis ended peacefully with the negotiated removal of the Soviet missiles from Cuba, the fear of nuclear Armageddon lingers today. Before this scary day, most Americans saw terrorism as a problem in the Middle East and were confident that, as in the past, two wide oceans and a mighty military would keep the United States safe from attack or invasion. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the confidence was shattered forever when members of the radical group Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial airliners and used them to carry out suicide terrorist attacks on the targets in the United States. 2 of the planes were flown into and destroyed both towers of World Trade Center in New York City, and a 3rd plane struck the Pentagon near Washington, D.C. And the 4th plane crashed in a field outside of Pittsburgh. By the end of the day, just 19 terrorists had killed nearly 3,000 people, injured more than 6,000 others, and inflicted over $10 billion in property damage. Fearing that similar attacks were imminent, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration banned all commercial and private aviation until enhanced security measures could be put in place at U.S. airports. For weeks, Americans looked up in fear whenever a jet flew overhead, as the only planes allowed in the air were military aircrafts. The attacks triggered the war on terror, including war against terrorist groups and terror-harboring regimes of Afghanistan and Iraq. Ultimately, the attacks left Americans with the resolve needed to accept laws like the Patriot Act of 2001, as well as strict and often intrusive security measures, which sacrificed some personal liberties in return for public safety. On November 10, 2001, President George W. Bush, addressing the General Assembly of the United Nations, said of the attacks, "Time is passing, yet for the United States of America, there will be no forgetting September the 11th. We will remember every rescuer who died in honor. We will remember every family that lives in grief. We will remember the fire and ash, the last phone calls, the funerals of the children." Friends, if you like my video, please press the like button and share it with your friends. Please subscribe my channel and hit the bell button so that I can reach you with more interesting videos. Thank you very much.